The tomb was silent, shrouded in dust and the weight of centuries. In the depths of an ancient forgotten world, long buried beneath the rubble of wars past, something stirred. A faint hum, imperceptible at first, grew into a resonating pulse that vibrated through the stone walls. The tomb's darkened heart, once a crypt for a monarch of an empire lost to time, now awakened in response to the chaos of the cosmos. It was not an ordinary awakening. The monarch had been dead for eons, his empire crumbled to dust by the cruelty of the Unforgiven wars, the final blood-soaked conflict that had shattered humanity into countless warring factions. His body, preserved in an intricate sarcophagus, remained untouched by time. His heart, once beating with the pulse of an unyielding rule, now lay silent. But something had disturbed the cosmic balance. A storm in space, a cataclysmic event, had torn through the fabric of the galaxy, rending the veil between life and death. In the cold, lifeless chamber, the monarch's eyes snapped open. It was not pain he felt. It was fury. He had been ripped from the peace of oblivion, and the fire of vengeance surged within him. He could feel the remnants of his empire haunting the galaxy, broken, scattered. Humanity, once united under his banner, had devolved into a fractured, desperate existence. He had been betrayed. The ones he trusted, the ones he fought alongside, had abandoned him to die alone, leaving the galaxy vulnerable to foreign invaders. The monarch's first movement was slow but deliberate. His hand, skeletal from centuries of decay, brushed against the ancient armor that had once been a symbol of his dominance. Now, it was merely a reminder of a time when his name was feared across the stars, a faint echo of his former self. The monarch took his first step into the tomb, and the dark stone reverberated with the weight of his return. As he walked, memories of his former life began to surface, fragments of the Unforgiven wars, the battles fought in the shadow of deceit. He had been the emperor of the Androsian Dominion, a civilization that spanned thousands of worlds. But betrayal had shattered that empire. His closest allies had turned on him, and with a single stroke, they had torn down everything he had built. The galaxy had bled for years, the Unforgiven wars consuming all in its path. And then, the invaders had arrived. The monarch's chest tightened at the memory of their faces, alien conquerors who had exploited humanity's fractures, bending the survivors to their will. The empire he had once ruled, the crown he had worn, was no more. The stars that had once been his domain were now dark, the scattered remnants of humanity clinging to life on crumbling colonies. The monarch's wrath flared. He would not let this stand. The galaxy would bow to him once more. His enemies, both human and alien, would be crushed beneath his boot. He would reclaim what was lost, and those who had abandoned him would pay for their treachery. But there was a greater challenge ahead, a mystery that gnawed at his mind. Who had disturbed his tomb? Who had dared to awaken him? The monarch's gaze turned toward the stars visible from the tomb's entrance. A strange light flickered among the distant constellations, an unfamiliar force stirring in the galaxy. It was the same force that had triggered his resurrection. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. The galaxy had changed in his absence. It would take more than just brute strength to conquer it now. But he had always been a ruler of cunning and intellect, as much as power. And soon, humanity would learn that the Revenant Monarch had returned, not to rule, but to reshape the very foundation of the galaxy itself. It was time for the world to remember his name. The monarch stepped out of the tomb, his boot making the faintest echo on the ancient stone. The wind outside was bitter, sharp as it whipped through the dead city around him. Once, this place had been a thriving capital, a center of power, with towering spires and streets that hummed with life. Now it lay in ruins, decayed, abandoned, forgotten. Time had swallowed the city whole, leaving only bones of a civilization long lost to the ages. As he moved through the deserted streets, memories assaulted him, ghostly flashes of what had once been. He could almost hear the murmur of his people, the clink of weapons on armor, The cadence of orders shouted from his commanders. These were the streets he had once ruled with an iron fist, the places where his voice had carried like thunder, commanding the stars. Yet now, all that remained was silence and ruin. His eyes narrowed in disdain. "How the mighty have fallen," he muttered under his breath, his voice low but filled with a deep, unwavering venom. He had heard rumors during his long slumber of humanity's fragmentation, of the desperate struggle for survival. The Unforgiven wars had torn the human race asunder, and it was clear to him now that the galaxy had not healed. It had only festered. As the monarch moved deeper into the city, he noticed the faint signs of life. Scavengers, small factions, the remnants of humanity's former might. His gaze locked onto the figures skirting the shadows, watching him from behind broken columns and ruined walls. They were cautious, uncertain, but they did not flee. They had felt his presence, sensed the return of something far older than their petty wars and factional struggles. Without a word, he gestured with a gloved hand, and the soldiers, if they could be called that, approached him. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with hunger and desperation, yet there was a spark of recognition in them when they saw the figure before them. It was as if they had sensed the power that lingered within him, the remnants of an empire long gone. They kneeled before him, even if they had no understanding of who or what he was. "Who are you?" One of them asked, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. "A ghost from the past, come to haunt us." The monarch stared down at the scavenger, his expression unreadable. "I am the Revenant Monarch, the ruler of the Androsian dominion. I was betrayed, and I died. But I have returned." His words carried with them a weight, an undeniable authority, even in this broken world. The soldier's eyes widened, but before he could speak again, the monarch waved him off. "Tell me of this galaxy," he demanded. "What has become of my empire? What is left of humanity?" The scavenger hesitated but then spoke, his voice trembling. "There are no empires anymore, Lord. The human race is fractured into warring factions, some small, some mighty. We have been scattered across the stars, divided. There are no great monarchs or emperors now, only survival." "Survival," the monarch repeated, a bitter smile curling at the corners of his lips. "That is not enough." He turned away, his mind racing. The invaders were still out there, this was evident. But there was something worse, something deeper at work. Humanity had become a mere shadow of its former self. They no longer held the fire of empire in their hearts. They were weak. No, he would not settle for survival. He would restore humanity to its rightful place, on top of the galaxy. The monarch set his eyes toward the distant horizon. "Prepare yourself," he said, his voice low but filled with a promise of what was to come. "The galaxy will bow to me once more. This time, there will be no betrayal, no weakness. Humanity will reign supreme again." As he strode away from the fallen city, the remnants of his old empire rising from the ashes in his wake, the scavengers looked on in awe and fear. Something ancient, something unstoppable had returned, and the galaxy would soon know the true meaning of power. The monarch did not waste time. The ruins of his former empire were but a fleeting memory, and the fractured remnants of humanity, scattered and splintered, needed to feel the weight of his return. He would not let the galaxy continue its descent into chaos. He would be the one to bring order, not through diplomacy, but through the sheer force of will. He spent days in the remains of the capital, gathering what fragments of his old command he could find. Those few who still remembered his name, old warlords, remnants of his former generals, were sought out. Some were eager to fall to their knees before him, their loyalty bought through fear and reverence. Others were hesitant, wary of the return of a ruler long thought dead. They had seen too many wars, too many promises broken. But they were in no position to refuse. The monarch's presence alone was enough to command them, his power radiating like the furnace of a dying star. The monarch began his campaign by consolidating control over the few remnants of his former empire. A single planet, far from the core of the galaxy, became his first target. A world long abandoned by his enemies, but rich in resources. It was the perfect place to start his return to power. Under the cover of darkness, his forces swept in, seizing control in a matter of days. The warlords who had ruled there, arrogant in their complacency, were eliminated in a blood-soaked night. Their followers either joined his cause or were scattered to the winds. The message was clear. The Revenant Monarch was back, and his wrath was unrelenting. As his forces grew, so did his reputation. His name spread like wildfire through the galaxy, whispered in fear by those who still remembered the dark days of his reign. Entire factions, long-standing as enemies of humanity, began to take notice. Some saw the monarch as a new power to be courted, others as a threat to be eliminated before he grew too strong. The galaxy was at war again, and it seemed the past was about to repeat itself. But there was something different about this war. The monarch was not the same man who had once ruled with an iron fist. The galaxy had changed, and so had he. The years of betrayal had hardened him, but there was also a deeper wisdom within him now. He saw the value in forging alliances where necessary, manipulating factions, and playing the long game. He had learned that brute force alone would not win him the galaxy. He needed something more, control over hearts and minds. In his pursuit of power, he found himself crossing paths with a new, unexpected player in the game, a young leader rising from the ashes of humanity's broken colonies. This leader, though unknown to the monarch, had become a symbol of hope for the scattered human factions. His rally spread like wildfire, his words carrying the fire of a new hope, one that could unite humanity against the monarch's return. The monarch, at first, dismissed the leader as a mere annoyance, a symbol, nothing more. But as his spies reported back, he began to realize that this young man was not just a puppet. He was gathering supporters at a rate that was faster than the monarch had anticipated. And what troubled him most was that this leader wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for freedom, a concept the monarch had long discarded. This human leader, a beacon of rebellion and defiance, posed a real challenge. And for the first time in his return, the monarch found himself truly intrigued. Could this young rebel be the one who would challenge his power, or was he merely a tool to be used? The monarch's thoughts were interrupted by a signal, a message encrypted with an ancient code, one that only his most trusted generals would use. It was a warning. Someone had learned of his return, and the galaxy's great powers were already mobilizing. An alliance of factions, human and alien alike, was forming to oppose him. His war would not be as easy as he had thought. But it didn't matter. The monarch had weathered far worse storms. His empire had crumbled once, but it would rise again. And this time, no one would be left standing to betray him. As the stars dimmed overhead, the Revenant Monarch knew that this was only the beginning. The galaxy was a fractured thing, and he would be the one to reshape it, by fire, by blood, and by his unyielding will. The monarch stood at the edge of his new stronghold, gazing out at the sprawling expanse of his growing empire. The world beneath him had been transformed. What was once a desolate, ruined landscape was now teeming with life. His forces, bolstered by recruits from all corners of the galaxy, had begun to reshape the very fabric of this corner of space. His power was undeniable, and his enemies were beginning to realize that resistance would cost them more than they could afford. Yet, as his influence spread, the shadow of his past grew longer. His eyes, once full of the fire of vengeance, now carried a new weight, an understanding that the battles ahead would not be won by mere force. Strategy, manipulation, and alliances would be his tools of conquest. But there was one thing he had not anticipated: the rise of the young leader, whose growing influence began to challenge his own. The monarch had initially dismissed him as nothing more than a fleeting figure, a symbol of rebellion that would crumble under the weight of his empire. But the more he observed, the more he realized that this leader was different. There was an uncanny resolve in his words, a fire in his spirit that galvanized the scattered remnants of humanity. His rallying cries for freedom and unity resonated across the galaxy like a spark to dry tinder. The Monarch's spies reported that the leader's army, though still small, was growing rapidly. The young man's charisma was unmatched. He was a leader born for these times, rallying forces with a promise of hope and the dream of a united humanity. But more troubling was the fact that he was not just speaking of rebellion. He was speaking of rebuilding, a vision of humanity beyond the broken fragments of the galaxy. He had become the one figure the monarch could not ignore. The monarch's thoughts were clouded with bitterness. This young man, a mere child in the grand scope of the galaxy, was standing in the way of the return to power he had so desperately sought. And worse, he was stirring something within the monarch that had been buried deep for years. Doubt. Doubt about the nature of his rule, about the brutality that had once defined him. But there was no room for hesitation. There was no space for weakness. The monarch knew that the only way to secure his empire was to crush this growing rebellion before it took root. However, as he prepared for war, something unexpected happened, a betrayal from within his own ranks. It began with whispers. First, it was rumors of a plot, rumors of a faction within his own loyalists secretly negotiating with the young leader, promising to hand over the monarch's stronghold in exchange for a better place in the new world the rebel offered. These traitors, led by a man the monarch had once trusted as a close advisor, were attempting to abandon him. The monarch's rage was swift and unforgiving. He summoned his generals, his most trusted lieutenants, and ordered the traitors to be brought before him. The betrayal ran deep. His advisor had been speaking to the enemy for months, feeding information, weakening his defenses. It was the most personal form of treason, the betrayal of trust, of loyalty. The advisor's plea for mercy fell on deaf ears. The monarch had no tolerance for weakness, no sympathy for those who would turn their backs on him. He had learned that no matter how great his empire had been, there would always be those who sought to undermine him. The punishment was swift, an example made of those who thought they could defy him. The blood of the traitors stained the floor of his throne room, but the monarch's resolve only hardened. This was not just about power anymore. This was about survival, his survival. The galaxy had shown him no mercy when they cast him aside, and he would show none to those who dared to stand against him. The rebellion, the traitors, the doubters, he would crush them all. But even as the monarch tightened his grip on his growing empire, a part of him couldn't help but wonder, was this really the path he wanted? Was he destined to become the very tyrant he had once fought against? The questions lingered in the back of his mind, but they would not slow his hand. Not yet. Not until his enemies were vanquished. Not until he was the undisputed ruler of the galaxy once more. And so, the war continued, one of betrayal, of shifting alliances, and of a monarch whose own humanity was slowly being swallowed by the hunger for power. The stage was set. The galaxy would either bow to him, or it would burn in his wake. The monarch's empire grew like a rising storm, vast and uncontrollable, sweeping through star systems and consuming everything in its path. But with each victory, the cracks within his empire grew wider. The victory over the traitors had been decisive, yet it had come at a cost. The remnants of trust that had once held his followers together were beginning to erode. Whispers of dissent, hidden among his closest commanders, crept through his ranks. He could feel it, subtle but undeniable, a quiet undercurrent of doubt in his leadership, a yearning for something more than the cold, tyrannical rule he embodied. His empire was built on fear, but fear alone would not sustain it. As the monarch solidified his control over the galaxy's fringe worlds, his name became synonymous with destruction and retribution. Yet, beneath the surface of his growing dominance, there was a disquieting truth. The more he crushed his enemies, the more isolated he became. The rebellion, led by the charismatic young leader, continued to grow in strength, its message of unity resonating deeply among the fractured colonies. The monarch had underestimated the power of hope. and the rallying cry for freedom was becoming louder with each passing day. It was not just the oppressed masses of humanity that rallied to his cause, but those who had once been loyal to the monarch's reign. Deserters, disillusioned generals, and powerful warlords who had seen the tyrant's cruelty firsthand. They had flowed into the rebel's arms, promising him support in exchange for a better future. The monarch could feel the shift in the galaxy. His grip, once so tight, was beginning to slip. His once unstoppable forces were being outmaneuvered, stretched thin by multiple fronts. The young leader's rebellion was no longer a scattered band of rebels. It was a force to be reckoned with, challenging the very foundations of his empire. In the midst of this growing chaos, the monarch received a message, a challenge. It was not from the rebel leader, but from someone far more unexpected, one of his own. A former general, once one of his most trusted, had publicly defected, declaring his loyalty to the rebel cause. He had a personal vendetta, one rooted in the monarch's past decisions, in the ruthless purges that had marked the end of the Unforgiven wars. The general's defection sent shockwaves through the empire, undermining the very core of the monarch's rule. The monarch seethed with fury. To be betrayed by a former general was a blow that cut deeper than any enemy's sword. This was no mere strategic setback. This was an assault on the very legitimacy of his reign. He had spent so many years building his empire, eliminating threats one by one, only to find that the greatest threat was always going to be from within. The general had not just betrayed him. He had declared the emperor's cruelty to be the true enemy of the galaxy. But the monarch would not be so easily undone. He knew that if he were to maintain control, he had to make an example of the general. He sent his most loyal commanders on a merciless hunt, and within days, the general was captured, his soldiers slaughtered, his fleet crushed. The monarch's vengeance was swift and brutal, and the general's fate was sealed in the cold vacuum of space. His name would be erased from history, his family's bloodline destroyed, and his legacy obliterated. Yet even as he stood victorious over his fallen adversary, the monarch could not escape the gnawing feeling of impending doom. Every conquest, every victory, was a temporary reprieve, a fleeting moment of control. His enemies, both within and without, were growing bolder, more unified. The rebellion, once a distant nuisance, was now his greatest threat. As the monarch brooded over the state of his empire, he knew that the time for subtlety had passed. He would need to destroy the rebellion once and for all. To do so, he would need more than just strength. He would need to crush the hope that fueled it, to expose the flaws in the leader's message, to turn the tides of war in his favor. It was not enough to defeat his enemies in battle. He needed to break them. And so, he prepared for his final strike. The galaxy would be his once again, and this time, no rebellion, no matter how strong, would stand in his way. It was time to make the ultimate move. The monarch would leave nothing behind but ashes. The monarch's empire was vast, but the forces opposing him were now more unified than ever. Across the galaxy, the rebel leader's message of unity had struck a chord in the hearts of many. It wasn't just about defeating the monarch anymore. It was about rebuilding, about reclaiming the hope that had been shattered by centuries of war and tyranny. And while the monarch's enemies were still scattered, their resolve had never been stronger. The monarch knew that his moment was approaching. The rebellion had grown too large, too powerful. He could feel the pull of destiny drawing him toward a final confrontation. There would be no more small battles, no more underhanded tactics. He had to crush the rebellion in one decisive strike. But even as he prepared his forces, something inside him began to twist, a gnawing unease he had not felt in years. The galaxy had always been a place of chaos, and he had ruled it with unyielding might. But now, as his empire had expanded, he found himself questioning everything. Was he truly the savior of humanity, or had he become the very thing he had once sought to destroy? A tyrant. He had spent so long building his power that he had lost sight of the purpose behind it. The galaxy had been fractured by betrayal, by the Unforgiven wars, and he had risen from the ashes to restore order. But in doing so, had he become the very force that oppressed the people he once sought to protect? Was his quest for vengeance just a thirst for power that could never be quenched? The monarch had always told himself that the ends justified the means, that the galaxy needed a strong hand to guide it. But now, as his forces prepared for the final strike against the rebellion, those words felt hollow. Still, the monarch could not afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when everything he had fought for was within his grasp. He had sacrificed too much, and to turn back now would be to lose everything. The rebellion would either fall or he would. There was no middle ground. He ordered his commanders to deploy the fleet, to rally every soldier, every ship, and every resource they could muster for the final assault. His forces moved swiftly, like a storm sweeping through the galaxy, taking planets, crushing resistance wherever they could find it. His eyes were set on the heart of the rebellion, the stronghold of the young leader who had dared to challenge him. But the monarch had underestimated the resolve of his enemies. As his fleet advanced, they found themselves met with something unexpected: unity. The scattered factions of the rebellion, each one once fragmented and weak, had come together under a single banner. Their fleets were smaller than his, their forces fewer, but they fought with a singular purpose. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about standing up to the tyranny he represented. The monarch watched from his flagship, his expression darkening as he saw the scale of the challenge before him. This was no longer just a battle of armies. It was a battle of ideologies. And for the first time, the monarch felt doubt stir deep within him. His mind raced with the realization that the rebellion was more than a group of scattered enemies. It was a movement, a force driven by something far more dangerous than guns and ships. The young leader's message of hope had become a rallying cry for those who had been oppressed for too long, for those who had lived in the shadow of the monarch's rule. He was no longer fighting just for power. He was fighting for something greater, a galaxy free from the shackles of tyranny. As the monarch's fleet approached the stronghold, the full weight of the situation hit him. He had spent so much time building his empire, constructing his vision of a galaxy ruled by strength and fear, that he had forgotten the most important truth. The galaxy was no longer afraid of him. The battle began with the deafening roar of guns and the screaming of ships as they tore through space. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, the monarch stood still, watching as the rebellion's forces met his own with an intensity that took him by surprise. This was not just a fight for the galaxy. It was a fight for its soul. For the first time in years, the monarch felt something stir inside him. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Was this the end of his reign, or was it the beginning of something else entirely? The lines between victory and defeat had never been so blurred. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and only one side would emerge from this final conflict. The battle raged in the void of space, a storm of fire and steel. The monarch's fleet, a once unstoppable force, collided with the united forces of the rebellion, each side determined to shape the future of the galaxy in their image. It was a spectacle of destruction. Planets burned, ships were torn apart, and the very fabric of space seemed to tremble under the weight of their conflict. The monarch stood at the helm of his flagship, watching the chaos unfold. His mind was a battlefield of its own, torn between the bloodthirsty desire to crush his enemies and the gnawing question that had plagued him for weeks. Was this victory worth the cost? The rebellion's forces were smaller, but their resolve was unshakable. Every soldier fought not just for survival, but for a dream. The dream of a galaxy free from the rule of a tyrant. The monarch's heart hardened as he watched his fleet carve through their defenses, but each victory felt hollow, as though he were merely delaying the inevitable. The galaxy was not afraid of him anymore. The fear he had built his empire upon had started to fade, replaced by something more powerful: hope. Despite his growing uncertainty, the monarch knew that retreat was not an option. There would be no second chances, no more moments to rethink his course. He had come this far, and the endgame was clear. He would either break the rebellion in this final clash, or watch as it consumed him and his empire. The fight was relentless, but the monarch's forces began to gain ground. His flagship tore through the rebellion's lines, its weapons unleashing devastation as his fleet methodically dismantled the opposing forces. The young leader, though present, was not on the front lines. He had hidden himself within the heart of his command ship, coordinating the defense with the fervor of a man who knew that the fate of the galaxy rested on this moment. The monarch could not help but respect that resolve, even as he hated it. In the distance, the monarch's flagship locked onto the rebels' command ship, and he gave the order for a final decisive strike. This would be the moment that shattered their hopes, that extinguished their fire for good. He would tear their leader from his place, ending the rebellion in one blow. But as his fleet advanced, the unexpected happened. A fleet of reinforcements, hidden in the far reaches of the system, emerged from the shadows. More ships, more soldiers, more strength than the monarch had anticipated. The rebellion had not only been united, but it had secretly been preparing for this day. They were not as desperate as he thought. They were ready, and they were more than willing to sacrifice everything to see his reign fall. The monarch's eyes widened as the reinforcements closed in on his fleet. The battle had just become something far more dangerous than he had imagined. In an instant, the tide of war shifted. The monarch's flagship, though still a massive symbol of power, was no longer invulnerable. The rebellion's forces surrounded it, outnumbering his ships and cutting off his escape routes. The monarch's commanders scrambled to reassert control, but panic began to spread through his ranks. This was no longer just about strategic brilliance. It was a matter of survival. He stood on the command deck, fists clenched, his eyes burning with fury. His fleet was faltering. The rebellion was growing stronger. He had underestimated them, underestimated the power of unity. And now it was too late to turn back. But even in the face of disaster, the monarch refused to surrender. He would not let it end like this. Not after everything he had fought for. He ordered the last, desperate assault, a full-force attack on the rebel command ship. This would be the final blow. The ships of both sides collided in a fury of fire and explosions, but even as he fought with all his might, a dark realization settled over him. Victory would come at a cost greater than he had ever imagined. His forces were crumbling. His empire, built on violence and fear, was slipping away. The price of his conquest had been far too high, and in the end, he realized that no matter how many battles he won, he had already lost something far more precious: the trust of the galaxy. As his ship was struck, and the screams of his dying soldiers echoed through the corridors, the monarch's thoughts turned to the young leader. He had thought the rebellion was nothing more than a fleeting dream, something to be crushed beneath his heel. But now, in the heat of this final battle, he saw it for what it truly was: the spirit of humanity, a spirit that refused to be broken. And as the monarch's flagship trembled under the assault, a cold truth settled in his heart. Victory had come, but it had come at a price that he could no longer afford to pay. The end of his reign was near. The monarch's flagship, once a symbol of his unmatched power, now drifted in the void, battered and broken. Explosions rocked the massive hull as the rebellion's forces closed in for the final blow. His fleet, shattered by the sudden reinforcements and the relentless onslaught of the enemy, had scattered in every direction. The sound of war was replaced by the eerie silence of his flagship's failing systems. The lights flickered and alarms blared, but even amidst the chaos, the monarch stood at the helm, unyielding. For the first time in years, doubt clouded his mind. His empire, built on fear and brutality, was crumbling. His dream of unifying the galaxy under his iron rule had been nothing more than a fragile illusion, shattered by a movement driven by hope, unity, and the unwavering belief that humanity deserved more. He had fought so hard to rebuild what had been lost, but in doing so, he had destroyed the very things that had once made him human. His gaze shifted to the viewscreen before him. The rebel command ship loomed in the distance, and he knew that its destruction would be the final step in extinguishing the rebellion's fire. Yet as the minutes passed and the weight of his inevitable defeat pressed down upon him, something else stirred within him, a longing, perhaps even a need, to see this war end, not with the destruction of his enemies, but with the possibility of something new. The monarch had seen too much death, too much suffering, to believe that his empire, built on the bones of the past, could ever last. He had become a prisoner of his own ambition, locked in a cycle of violence and retribution that had consumed everything he once held dear. The galaxy he had sought to control now seemed beyond his grasp. The young leader of the rebellion had shown him a future where strength was not the only virtue, where humanity could rise from the ashes of war without becoming a reflection of the very destruction they had suffered. A sharp, metallic voice interrupted his thoughts. "Your Majesty, the rebellion is preparing for a final strike. They're targeting the heart of the fleet." The monarch's jaw clenched. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him, but the fire of defiance still burned in his chest. He had not come this far to bow out now. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. We fight until the end," he ordered, though his voice lacked the conviction it once held. As his crew scrambled to follow orders, the monarch's thoughts shifted. He knew that he was no longer fighting for his empire. He was fighting to preserve his own legacy. His name, his reign. It would either be remembered as the moment humanity was broken, or as the last desperate gasp of a man who failed to see the greater truth. The final battle began in earnest. Missiles and energy blasts tore through space, but the monarch's forces were outmatched. His ship shuddered as a direct hit rocked the bridge. He barely held his footing, his eyes narrowing in determination. He had reached the breaking point. He had either already lost or would lose soon. In the distance, the rebel command ship surged forward, its hull gleaming with the promise of victory. And at its heart, the young leader, unbowed, stood in the face of his nemesis, knowing that this moment would change everything. His movement was not just about overthrowing the monarch. It was about reclaiming a future, one that would belong to humanity, not to a single ruler. The monarch watched the advancing ship, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. The rebellion had won, not because they had the most powerful fleet or the largest army, but because they had a cause that resonated with those who had been forgotten, those who had no voice in the shadow of an empire. As his flagship began to break apart, the monarch made a decision. His reign was over. The war was lost. There was no victory to claim here. He turned to his crew, his face cold and resigned. "Prepare the escape pods. Leave this ship. It's over." For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the galaxy lift from his shoulders. His power was slipping away, and as the escape pods launched into the darkness of space, the monarch looked out into the void. The galaxy was changing. His empire would fall, and humanity would rise from the ashes, not in his image, but in their own. The monarch, the last emperor of a broken galaxy, disappeared into the dark abyss. His reign had ended, not with a victory, but with the quiet acceptance of the truth. The future belonged to those who dared to hope, and not to those who ruled by fear. And in the silence that followed, the galaxy began to heal.